The humble mouse appears in a surprising amount of folklore, both a harbinger of death if spotted in the house and a medical remedy for a weird range of ailments. It seems the mouse both harms and heals. This reputation even stretches back to ancient Egypt, demonstrating just how ambivalent humans have felt about the tiny rodent for centuries. With strange origin stories, links to a Belgian saint, a use in divination and a helpful role as the tooth mouse, their lore covers a lot of bases. So let's have a look at the mouse in folklore in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well. And as I've said before, when I say that, I do actually legitimately mean it. I do hope that you're well, because it would be really rubbish to hope otherwise. But there we go. I did look at a range of different animals for what this last episode could be. And I ended up picking the mouse, because once I started looking into it, I was like, whoa, there is so much folklore that I wasn't really anticipating. Now, I have done rats before, and I thought, is it going to be quite similar? And bits of it are, but then bits of it just go off in this completely weird direction that I don't think anybody ever really predicted. So we are going to have a look at mice to round off this Folklore of Mammals month. And as I did promise, next month is going to be a Christmas-free zone. And I've had so many messages and comments from people who are quite pleased to hear that again, if you want the Christmas episodes, I will actually make a separate festive playlist on YouTube for them. I think I can do that on Spotify as well. But I'll upload my Christmas episodes to YouTube because obviously I haven't done that yet. So if you're listening to this on the podcast feed, just ignore that. But if you're listening on YouTube, I will upload the Christmas ones, but feel free to ignore them if you don't want to listen to them. And obviously the actual theme for December is going to be underwater folklore, because somebody asked for underwater ghosts and I'm like, wow, that is a really cool theme. I wonder what I'll find. And I can say that I'm going to do one of the bits of folklore and legend that I can't believe I've never done. And bearing in mind, I started this in January 2019. I've never done the Loch Ness Monster. So we will be having a look at Nessie in next month at some point in December. So you can look forward to that. And as I say, while I am doing underwater folklore, I did wonder if it was a little bit on the nose, as it were, because of all the horrible, horrible flooding that's been going on, particularly in Wales at the moment. I did have it planned, about 3 weeks ago now. And I'm focusing more on underwater stuff, as in off the coast. I hope that people understand which way I'm going with that. And as I say, my heart absolutely goes out to anybody who has been affected by the floods, because it looks absolutely appalling. And it just goes to show what climate change is doing. So that is how we're going to be approaching underwater folklore. It is going to be more coastal and sea-based than anything else. But back to regular mammals. Actually, would Nessie be a reptile? Because I guess if she's supposedly a dinosaur, then possibly. I don't know. We'll get into that in December. We're back to mammals though, and we're going to have a look at mice. And they've actually got some interesting origin stories. And Irish folklore actually contains 2 tales to explain where they came from. In one of them, St. Martin left some food under a tub and he told the other monks not to touch it until the next day. It's not clear on why he did this. But as you can guess, one monk completely ignored this rule and lifted the tub to have a look. And the moment he did so, a horde of mice ran out and St. Martin had to deal with the issue. His way of doing so was to throw his glove at them, which turned into a cat, and presumably the cat dealt with the issue instead. But that explains where mice came from. The other tale from Ireland involved St. Columcille, and he wanted to feed the poor, so he asked Jesus for help. Jesus gave him some cooking fat and told him to leave it in a pot for 24 hours. If he did so, plenty of young pigs would climb out of the pot and therefore provide plenty of food for the poor. So St. Columcille did exactly as he was told, but only mice emerged at the end of the 24-hour period, because it turned out that the serving girl had stolen some of the fat and put it in a bowl for herself. Now, the act of theft doomed the fat to become an animal well known for stealing food. And it's quite interesting because they're both similar in a way, but in ancient Egypt, completely different story. So people actually believed that the mouse just spontaneously appeared from the Nile whenever the river receded, which is quite an interesting one. There was also another piece of folklore that mice didn't reproduce the way you would expect them to. They just spontaneously conceived if they licked salt. So there's some interesting stories about mice. But speaking of ancient Egypt, one of the things I was fascinated by is the use of the mouse in medicine. And this does date back to ancient Egypt. And what's quite fascinating about this is occasionally you can come across things that are supposed to be linked with Egypt, and it's unclear where that came from. However, the use of the mouse does actually appear in various papyri, and there's actually archaeological evidence of such a use as well, which obviously makes it a little bit more interesting in the sense that we have proof that some of these things were done. Whether they worked or not obviously remains to be seen. But the mouse was very much seen as beneficial in medicine, but seen as a bad omen in pretty much every other way. And that mouse was considered an associate of those enemies of Ra, obviously Ra being the sun god. So if you were an enemy of Ra, then the mouse would hang out with you. Now, in the Abus papyrus, one recipe suggested that you would mix equal parts of pig, mouse, snake and cat fat, and then you would apply that to any areas beset with rheumatoid stiffness. Meanwhile, the Hearst Medical Papyrus recommended that you put a cooked mouse in fat until it rotted away, and then you would apply the fat to the hair, although the article I was reading didn't explain why you would do that. A spell in another papyrus concerned with magic suggested that an ill child should eat a cooked mouse, and the parent should then bind the mouse's bones with string tied in 7 knots, and the child would then wear that around their neck. Again, that is an interesting use of medicine, although we'll come back to this idea of eating mice because it comes back up again. Dioscorides said that mice could be applied to scorpion stings, and parents could also apparently prevent children from dribbling by making them eat roasted mice. One recipe also suggested smearing everything that you had with the fat from a cat to stop mice running around on it. And I think that's a kind of apotropaic idea that if you use something from the mouse's natural enemy, it would therefore ward off the mouse. I feel a bit sorry for the cat that would have to provide the fat though. Now, surprisingly, Warren Dawson actually suggested that people were still using mice for medicinal purposes in the 1920s in England and Wales, because he reported that mice were sometimes made into a pie and given to children to cure incontinence, dribbling or whooping cough. That said, reports existed of people making their children eat roasted or fried mice into the 1980s to cure whooping cough, which is really quite appalling in so many different ways. And the particular snippet that I found actually seemed to claim that it worked, and you're like, oh, maybe it was a coincidence. But it seems really interesting that this particular belief of children eating cooked mice to ward off illness or to cure illness actually has such a long antiquity to it. There was also a belief in 1958 that was recorded in Norfolk that rubbing a dead mouse on the cheek would end toothache. I'd really rather that you didn't do that. It does seem fascinating that there are all these different uses for mice that involves usually eating them. They're nearly always cooked first, and one of the articles did specify that parents usually didn't tell their children what they were eating. But I would just, please don't do any of those at home. It's just, ugh. Now, there was also another use for mice, which involves them actually being alive, which is much more preferable in my opinion. And this involves mouse divination, or myomancy. And the ancient Greeks and Romans would use both rats and mice in myomancy, and the name comes from mus or mouse and mantea or prophecy. Now, thankfully, this isn't the type of cut something open and look at its guts divination. Instead, priests would watch how the mice behaved, and then they would draw their auguries from that accordingly. So they might open a cage to release a mouse and see how it escaped and which direction it chose, or they might let a mouse loose in a maze and then draw conclusions from the route that it took. If the mouse cried at any point, this was considered a bad omen. Now, Pliny considered mice prophetic animals, and he said that finding white mice meant good luck, which is something that we also see around white rats. He also relates mice prophesying wars and the death of generals based on what they gnawed, like shields and even shoelaces. And meanwhile, Marie Trevelyan recorded that if a mouse nibbled your clothes, you would die soon. So there's another Welsh death omen for you. But even the sheer number of mice that might arrive in your house was an omen, so if you found a sudden influx of them, that meant that death would visit the house, while a mouse running over someone meant they would die. There were also examples of people being made to leave their companions because a mouse had run in front of them. They hadn't even touched them, just ran past them. So I think there is this real fear of mice in particular. And there are obviously some practical concerns for that, and I think there are quite a lot of associations that I came across between mice and plague, or indeed mice and famine. So I think you can understand where if you suddenly had an influx of mice that then ate all of your food, or indeed obviously ate all of the villagers' food, then you could see why people would then associate seeing them with impending death of some description. But this then doesn't explain the link between the mouse and the soul, because in the medieval era, some people believed that the soul might take the form of a mouse, and there's a Saxon story which featured an episode of a soul leaving the mouth of a sleeping person in the form of a red mouse. A similar belief in Transylvania meant children were supposed to sleep with their mouths closed in case the soul ran away as a mouse and the child never woke up again. But it was also powerless to harm the soul mouse, which would likewise harm the human, and even moving the sleeper was dangerous since the mouse would be unable to find and re-enter the body. And Sabine Baring-Gould actually relates a tale from Germany in which servants actually saw a mouse run out of a miller's mouth. They then scared the mouse away, not realising what the mouse actually was, and then found they could never rouse the miller. In Germany, people believe the soul left the body as a mouse specifically after death, not just at random as we get in these other stories, and the souls of maidens and children in particular took the form of white mice. But either way, whether you were a maiden child or not, the soul would then spend its first night as a mouse with St. Gertrude, the second with St. Michael, and then the third wherever it was that they were supposed to go. Now, I must admit, this idea of spending the evening with St. Gertrude is a bit of an odd one, because of the fact that, yes, St. Gertrude is seen as a patron saint of souls, and she's then associated with this mouse symbol, but she's not there as a patron of mice. She's the saint that people appeal to drive mice away, so it seems really odd that the soul mice would then spend time with her. Because, like I say, St. Gertrude was the saint to call upon to drive away rats, mice and bats, and according to legend, this dislike of animals considered as vermin came from a particular incident, because the devil decided to try St. Gertrude's patience by tearing her spinning yarn in the form of a mouse. And there are various other stories as well that she was able to just drive mice away by her very presence. And official processions in honour of St. Gertrude took place in Cologne until the 18th century to ask for her help in driving away mice. It was traditional to put away your spinning wheel on St. Gertrude's Day or March the 17th, lest mice would eat your yarn. And her association with driving away mice probably explains why she's become the unofficial patron saint of cats. There is a suggestion that St. Gertrude actually took the place of Holda or Perchta, the ancient Teutonic goddesses, who apparently turned into white mice in order to get into someone's home. But I do think it's quite an odd idea that if St. Gertrude is therefore linked with goddesses that could take the form of mice, the idea that she would then be the one who drives mice away is quite an interesting one. And I'd never come across St. Gertrude before, so that was quite interesting to have a look into, to find that some people were like, oh, she's the remains of an ancient rodent goddess. And I'm like, or maybe she was just famous for being able to drive them away while she was still alive. I don't know. But then I thought there's a lot of stuff in here which isn't very positive about mice. And I thought, there's got to be something positive, and the last two stories kind of are. And the first one, I just wanted to retell the fable of the mouse and the lion. Now, this has been made more famous, I think, by Aesop's fables. It does actually date back to a Demotic papyrus and is then retold in a Greek version, so it just shows how old some of these fables are. But in this story, a little mouse ran under a lion's paws. But before the lion could actually crush her with a paw, the mouse pointed out that if he ate her, he'd still be hungry. But if he let her go, she could one day repay the favour. Now the lion thought that she was joking in her ability to save his life, but he did agree that because she was so small, she wouldn't make much of a satisfying meal, and thus released her, and away she went. But it was a good thing that he did, because soon after, a hunter caught the lion in a pit. The hunter tied the lion up with rope and left him to take back to his village in the morning. Luckily, the little mouse turned up, and she reminded the lion who she was and why she was there. And obviously the lion, I would imagine, was quite pleased to see her by this point, because she fulfilled her promise and gnawed through the lion's bonds. And this is the part of the story I love the most. She then hid in his mane once he was free, and they ran away into the wilderness. And I love that. That is a buddy movie that we need to see, people. I just think that's such a lovely mental image. And it does just go to show, I think, that idea of the moral of, you know, obviously repaying kindness, but also doing kindness to people because you never know when they might be able to help you back. And also the idea of not overlooking someone who seems small and wee, who might actually be able to help, or who might actually just be a really good friend at some point as well. So I think the lion learns a little bit of humility in that one, which I quite like. But I wanted to end with the idea of the tooth mouse, because many people might be familiar with the concept of the tooth fairy, but this tooth mouse is another idea. And obviously I've done the tooth fairy on the podcast before, but the tooth mouse was more prevalent in France and Spain, and a French fairy tale by Madame d'Aulnay from 1697 sees a fairy take the form of a mouse to steal an evil king's teeth. But by contrast, the Tooth Fairy doesn't actually appear in print until 1927 in The Tooth Fairy 3-act playlet for children by Esther Watkins Arnold. So I was quite fascinated to see how much the idea that you left money for a mouse was actually quite prevalent. So as one example, an American superstition collected in the 1920s among college girls held that if you lost a tooth, you should put it in your shoe that night, and then you would find a 10-cent piece in its place the next morning because a mouse had bought it. And I was also quite pleased to see that in South Africa, a similar belief persists, with the tooth mouse far more common than the tooth fairy. And there's a really good article about that by Kat Hellison, and I was so pleased to see Kat's article on the Folklore Thursday website when I was doing this research, because I know Kat anyway, because they're a fellow author and their books are absolutely phenomenal. So please do check out Kat Hellison. Honestly, seriously, if you like fantasy fiction, Kat does some amazing books. But I thought it was really interesting that they'd written this article about the tooth mouse and how prevalent it is as a story in South Africa. That again, obviously when your child loses their tooth, you then give them money from the tooth mouse, not the tooth fairy. But there is a link between children and teeth and mice anyway, because in the Scottish Highlands, parents put their children's milk teeth into the nearest mouse hole, and a similar belief also appears in Germany and Mexico, because apparently this was to ensure that the adult tooth would come through, because it would only do this if the parent left the milk tooth in the mouse hole. And according to Warren Dawson, Jewish children in southern Russia threw their milk teeth onto the roof, asking mice to give them an iron tooth to replace the tooth that they had lost. And this is something that you get in folklore, particularly around rats as well, that people would leave their milk teeth for mice or rats, because obviously their teeth grow continually. That's the whole thing with rodents. So they've got strong teeth that keep growing. So if you lose a tooth, you want a strong tooth to replace it. So that's where obviously this idea of sympathetic magic, if you leave the tooth for the mouse, then you should get a nice strong tooth like theirs coming through. Hopefully not one that continues growing, because that has a whole other set of issues associated with it. But I did think that was really interesting that the tooth mouse becomes a far more logical choice of being to come and collect your teeth than a fairy does. Because what is a fairy going to use your teeth for? I mean, you could argue what's a mouse going to use them for, and in some of the variations, they use them to build their house, which is kind of a bit gross on various levels. But yes, I just thought the tooth mouse was a nice way to end this episode, because there's all this like, yeah, you can eat them to cure whooping cough. And I thought, no, let's have something positive to end on. So, in conclusion, what do we actually make of this mouse folklore? Well, I think that a lot of it comes down to this idea of harming and healing. And there is this old belief that mice and rats cause plague, so therefore they could also heal things as well. And you do tend to find mice a little bit more in medicine rather than rats and so on. But I think that's where that comes from. There's even links as well between mice and a particular version of Apollo, because obviously Apollo, the god of plague, would bring plague, and then obviously it makes sense that he would then be associated with the animal that would bring the plague, but then could also potentially cure things as well. I'm not quite sure why the mouse then takes the form of the soul, unless it's just because it's small. But considering how you also see things like butterflies taking the form of the soul, which makes far more sense really through the link with Psyche, I'm not quite sure why people came up with that one, but it's an interesting one nonetheless. It may just be that people happen to see mice running around next to sleeping people and made the association. And obviously if you're going to see something in your room at night, then I do think a mouse is probably more likely than a lot of other things. But why not a spider or something like that? Obviously the mouse divination one I thought was really interesting, and you know how much I love different forms of divination, which is why I'm writing a whole book about for the folklore of divination. But I do think this is something that you could try yourself if you actually have pet mice, if you've got a hamster, if you've got rats, if you've got a maze. Decide what each different route means, ask a question, release the pet and see where it goes, and then there's your answer. And I thought that was a really fun way to still be able to practice mymancy, and then your pet gets a treat at the end, so everybody wins. And like I say, I think the tooth mouse is a far cuter concept than the tooth fairy. To me, it's also actually slightly less creepy as well, if I'm completely honest. But it does feed into those ideas around the strength and continual growth of rodent teeth. So that one does actually make sense. And I can see why people would draw that particular link. And because there were already these practices about giving your tooth to the mouse, either by throwing them on the roof or putting them in the mouse hole, it makes sense that you would then create a being that would then actually just come and collect them instead, because it would be far easier. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that particular episode on the mouse in folklore. It is a very strange one, as I say, but there we go. As I say, there is the rats episode as well if you're interested in other rodents. But as I said at the beginning, we are going to have a look at underwater folklore in December, so that should certainly be quite an interesting one. And if you do have any special requests, please do let me know and I'll see what I can do. But anyway, I hope you have a marvellous week ahead and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.